In 1914, explorer Ernest Shackleton sailed toward Antarctica aboard a wooden ship called the Endurance. The mission was supposed to become one of the greatest triumphs in exploration history. Newspapers celebrated him before he even arrived. Investors believed they were funding destiny itself. The crew carried confidence like armor. But months later, the Antarctic ice trapped the ship completely. The ocean froze around them with mechanical indifference. Day after day, the pressure increased until the wood began screaming under the force of the ice. Then the ship cracked apart. The men watched their future sink into freezing black water. No rescue signal would save them. Noro udma existid. Temperatures dropped below human tolerance. Hunger became constant. Isolation distorted time. Some crew members began showing signs of psychological collapse. Others stopped speaking entirely. Shackleton understood something terrifying in that frozen silence. Survival would not depend on intelligence, talent, or motivation. It would depend on whether exhausted human beings could continue functioning while trapped inside hopelessness. History remembers the survival story, but almost nobody talks about the emotional reality hidden underneath it. The real battle was not against Antarctica. It was against frustration, against the slow death of certainty, against the humiliation of realizing effort does not guarantee progress, against the unbearable feeling of waking up every morning to another day without visible improvement. Most people think destruction happens in dramatic moments, but human beings usually break much slower than that. Modern life rarely looks catastrophic from the outside. Nobody sees ice crushing the walls around you. Nobody hears wood splintering beneath your feet. Instead, frustration arrives disguised as ordinary life. A rejected application, a business that grows too slowly, a body that refuses to change, an empty inbox, a silent phone, another attempt that produces nothing visible. At first, people resist. They push harder. They search for motivation. They consume advice obsessively. But something dangerous happens when effort and reward stop arriving together. The human nervous system begins interpreting delay as failure. The brain starts conserving energy. Hope becomes expensive. Discipline starts feeling unnatural. Eventually, many people reach a hidden emotional threshold where avoiding disappointment becomes more important than pursuing growth. That is the moment ambition quietly dies. Not in public, not dramatically, but internally. Person still goes to work, still answers messages, still smiles in conversations. Yet psychologically, they begin shrinking their lives to avoid emotional friction. They stop attempting difficult things because frustration no longer feels temporary. It feels personal. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every rejection becomes identity. Every slow result becomes a verdict on human worth. And without realizing it, people begin organizing their entire existence around emotional self-protection. Not around purpose, not around meaning, not around potential, around avoiding the feeling of failing again. The terrifying part is that society often rewards this behavior. Safe choices look responsible. Emotional numbness looks mature. Low expectations look realistic. Meanwhile, millions of people slowly abandon versions of themselves that never had the chance to fully exist. What makes this even more disturbing is that frustration is not simply emotional weakness. It is biological, neurological, predictable. The human brain evolved to conserve energy and avoid uncertainty. For most of human history, wasted effort could mean death. If repeated actions produced no reward, the nervous system learned to reduce risk, reduce movement, reduce expectation. Survival favored efficiency, not persistence. And that ancient machinery still operates inside modern people every day. That is why slow progress feels physically painful. Why rejection lingers in the body long after words disappear. Why humiliation can paralyze behavior for years. Why people sabotage goals they genuinely care about. The brain interprets uncertainty as threat, but history repeatedly reveals something strange. Certain individuals learned how to continue operating even while exhausted, uncertain, rejected, embarrassed, ignored, or psychologically overwhelmed. Not because they felt fearless. Not because they possessed magical confidence. But because they discovered ways to stop treating frustration as a signal to retreat. Some learned it through brutal environments. Others through repeated public failure. Others through isolation, discipline, repetition, or unbearable waiting. Again and again, across different centuries and different lives, the same pattern appears. The people who endure are not the people who suffer less. They are the people who stop negotiating with discomfort. And once that psychological shift happens, frustration loses part of its power. Pain still exists, doubt still exists, failure still arrives. But the emotional reaction changes completely, because the human being is no longer asking, "How do I escape this feeling?" The question becomes far more dangerous. How long can I continue despite it? There is a paradox hiding inside almost every meaningful human achievement. The people most admired for discipline, mastery, endurance, or greatness were often not protected from frustration. They were exposed to more of it than everyone else. More rejection, more uncertainty, more repetition, more invisible effort without immediate reward. And over time, something inside them changed. The average person experiences frustration as evidence to stop. But certain individuals trained themselves to experience it as evidence they were still in the process. That difference sounds small. In reality, it separates entire destinies. Because if frustration is interpreted as danger, the brain retreats. But if frustration is interpreted as adaptation, the brain endures long enough to transform. This means one of the most destructive beliefs in modern life may also be one of the most common. The belief that progress should feel encouraging while it is happening. History suggests the opposite. Often, the most important transformations feel unbearable while they are still incomplete. The body wants relief. The ego wants certainty. The mind wants visible proof. But reality often responds with silence for very long periods of time. So the real question is not whether frustration can be eliminated. Cannot. The real question is far more uncomfortable. If the human nervous system naturally tries to escape uncertainty, rejection, delay, embarrassment, and failure, then how did certain people train themselves to remain functional inside those emotions long enough to become extraordinary? And what happens once someone finally learns how? In the late 1960s and early 1970s, psychologist Walter Mischel and his colleagues at Stanford University placed young children alone inside a quiet room. On the table in front of them sat a small reward, often a marshmallow, sometimes a cookie or pretzel stick. The instructions were painfully simple. The child could eat the reward immediately, or they could wait alone for several minutes and receive a second one. That was the entire experiment. No physical pain, no threat, no punishment. And yet what unfolded inside those rooms revealed something unsettling about human nature. The children squirmed in their chairs. Some covered their eyes. Some kicked the desk. Others grabbed the marshmallow, smelled it, licked it lightly, then forced themselves to put it back down. A few tried singing to themselves. Others turned away from the table entirely as if distance alone could weaken temptation. The room became a battlefield between impulse and restraint. Many children lasted only seconds. The important detail was not hunger. Most of them were not starving. The real struggle was psychological. Waiting generated internal friction. The discomfort of not receiving immediate relief began consuming their attention. For some children, the emotional tension became intolerable almost instantly. Their brains treated delay like suffering. And beneath that small moment sat a larger human pattern that adults rarely admit openly. People do not only chase pleasure. They also flee frustration, sometimes with more urgency than they pursue their own future. What made the experiment unforgettable was not merely which children waited. It was how they managed to survive the waiting. Walter Mischel noticed that the children who resisted temptation were not necessarily calmer, smarter, or naturally more disciplined. In many cases, they were actively fighting themselves every second. But they used psychological strategies that changed the emotional meaning of the situation. Some children distracted themselves by inventing games. Some stared at the ceiling. Some spoke aloud to imaginary people. Others transformed the marshmallow in their minds into something abstract instead of edible. The children who failed often remained psychologically trapped beside the reward. Their attention fused with the object itself. They stared directly at it, thought about it constantly, measured the seconds emotionally. The longer they focused on the desire, the more unbearable the delay became. This became one of the experiment's most disturbing revelations. The mind amplifies frustration through attention. What people repeatedly focus on grows emotionally larger inside the nervous system. Delay feels longer when constantly monitored. Pain intensifies when obsessively measured. The brain can transform temporary discomfort into psychological torture simply through fixation. Adults do this constantly. They count how long success is taking, how many times they were ignored, how far away the reward still feels. And eventually the mind stops experiencing effort as movement. It experiences effort as imprisonment. The terrifying part is that many people never realize they are not defeated by reality first. They are defeated by the way their attention interacts with frustration. Years later, researchers followed many of the children from the experiment into adolescence and adulthood. The results became internationally famous, though often misunderstood in superficial ways. The children who managed to delay gratification tended, on average, to perform better across multiple areas of life. Some showed stronger academic performance. Some demonstrated greater emotional regulation under stress. Others appeared more capable of planning, adapting, and functioning under pressure. But the deeper implication was not that successful people possess superior willpower like some mystical gift. The real revelation was harsher. Human beings who learn to tolerate temporary emotional discomfort gain access to behaviors that other people abandon too early. That changes everything, because almost every meaningful achievement requires surviving periods where reward is invisible. Training the body before physical transformation appears. Building skills before competence becomes visible. Working in obscurity before recognition arrives. Repeating actions long before confidence catches up. Most people assume failure happens because they lack talent. But often, the collapse begins much earlier. They cannot emotionally survive the delay between effort and evidence. And once frustration crosses a certain threshold, the nervous system begins demanding immediate relief. The person procrastinates, distracts themselves, changes goals, escapes into entertainment, abandons the process entirely, not because the goal was impossible, but because uncertainty became intolerable. This is why frustration destroys so many futures quietly. Not through catastrophe, through accumulated surrender to short-term emotional escape. The Stanford experiment revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the human condition. Frustration is not merely an obstacle standing in the way of progress. It is the filter deciding who continues long enough to experience progress at all. And the modern world has become extraordinarily efficient at destroying this capacity. Endless stimulation trains the brain to expect immediate emotional payoff. Notifications interrupt boredom instantly. Entertainment removes silence. Food arrives in minutes. Validation appears through screens within seconds. The nervous system becomes conditioned to escape discomfort the moment it appears. Then reality demands something entirely different. Years of invisible practice. Repeated rejection without reassurance. Effort without applause. Discipline without emotional reward. For many people, this collision becomes psychologically devastating. They enter ambitious goals carrying a nervous system trained for immediacy. So when progress slows, the brain interprets normal difficulty as a sign that something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. The person is simply encountering the emotional cost of meaningful adaptation for the first time. And this creates a dangerous illusion. The belief that frustration means incapability. In truth, frustration often means the process is finally becoming real. Yet there is another layer beneath all this that researchers eventually discovered. Something darker than impatience. Something capable of destroying persistence entirely. Because what happens when a human being stops believing waiting matters at all is far more catastrophic than simple impulsiveness. At that point, the mind no longer struggles against frustration. It surrenders to it. For many people, rejection does not merely block opportunity. It rewrites identity. By the early 1990s, Joanne Rowling was living under conditions that felt emotionally and financially unstable. She had experienced the collapse of her marriage. She was raising her daughter as a single mother. At certain moments, she depended on state benefits while trying to finish a manuscript she had begun imagining years earlier during a delayed train journey between Manchester and London. The story centered on a boy wizard named Harry Potter. But at the time, the manuscript looked less like destiny and more like evidence of denial. Rowling later described herself as feeling like a failure by conventional standards. Her life did not resemble success. It resembled stagnation, isolation, uncertainty stretched across years. And still she kept writing, often in cafes, sometimes while her daughter slept beside her. She wrote in fragments, under pressure, without guarantees that anyone would ever care. The work demanded emotional energy she could barely afford psychologically. Then came the rejections. Publisher after publisher declined the manuscript. Some never responded at all. Others rejected it directly. The letters were professional, brief, emotionally cold. To the publishing industry, this was routine. To the human nervous system, it was something else entirely. Because repeated rejection creates a dangerous psychological question. What if the world is revealing the truth about you? Not about the project. Not about timing. Not about probability. About you. That is where many people break. Not when they fail once, but when failure begins sounding believable. What made Rowling's situation psychologically brutal was not only rejection itself. It was repetition without evidence. Each rejected manuscript forced the same emotional cycle to repeat again. Hope while submitting, silence while waiting, anxiety interpreting every delay. Then another refusal, another confirmation that the outside world remained unmoved. Most people underestimate what this does to the mind over time. Human beings construct identity partially through reflected feedback. Encouragement strengthens belief. Recognition stabilizes effort. Social validation reduces uncertainty. But repeated rejection creates the opposite effect. The person begins carrying two realities simultaneously. Internally, they still feel connected to the possibility. Externally, reality keeps denying it exists. That contradiction becomes exhausting, and eventually the nervous system attempts to protect itself by lowering expectation. Ambition starts feeling dangerous because hope repeatedly produces pain. Many people slowly detach from their own aspirations not because they stopped caring, but because caring became emotionally expensive. This is why rejection reshapes identity so powerfully. The brain starts asking, who continues pursuing something after the world repeatedly says no? The answer feels irrational, embarrassing even, yet Rowling continued sending the manuscript out. Eventually, Bloomsbury Publishing accepted Harry Potter, and the Philosopher's Stone, after the chairman's 8-year-old daughter, reportedly enjoyed reading the first chapter. That detail matters, because history often compresses success into inevitability after it happens. But before recognition arrives, persistence rarely feels heroic. It feels humiliating, especially when nobody else can yet distinguish perseverance from delusion. There is another reason rejection becomes so psychologically destructive. It attacks continuity. Human beings need to believe effort is connected to outcome. Even small signs of progress help the nervous system tolerate uncertainty. But repeated rejection interrupts that connection. The person begins exerting emotional energy into a void that offers no visible response. That silence changes behavior. Some people stop creating entirely. Others lower their ambitions to safer goals. Others remain active externally while internally detaching from hope itself. Because disappointment repeated often enough stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling structural. Rowling later spoke openly about reaching what she described as rock bottom. Yet she also described that period as strangely liberating. Failure removed illusions. It stripped away performance. There was no reputation left to protect, no image left to maintain. Only the work itself remained. That psychological shift matters more than people realize. Many individuals are not destroyed by failure alone. They are destroyed by the collapse of the identity they hoped success would protect. They want achievement not only for accomplishment, but for emotional permission to finally feel worthy. Rejection threatens that fantasy directly. And when enough rejection accumulates, people begin negotiating against themselves internally. Maybe the dream was unrealistic. Maybe they misunderstood their abilities. Maybe continuing itself becomes the embarrassment. This is where frustration mutates into something deeper than disappointment. It becomes self-erasure. The person does not merely lose confidence in the project. They begin losing confidence in their right to persist at all. What ultimately makes Rowling's story so unsettling is not simply that success arrived after rejection. It is that the rejection itself became part of the psychological training required to survive success later. Because global recognition did not eliminate pressure. Fame did not remove criticism. Public visibility magnified it. Every future book carried impossible expectations. Millions of readers projected judgment onto her work. The emotional exposure became enormous. But years earlier, something had already been forged in isolation. The repeated experience of hearing no without stopping. That adaptation changed the relationship between identity and external validation. Rejection still hurt. Criticism still existed. But persistence no longer depended entirely on approval. The work had survived long enough without recognition that continuing became psychologically separate from immediate acceptance. Most people never reach that stage. Not because they lack talent. Not because opportunity never appears. But because repeated rejection quietly trains them to abandon themselves before reality ever delivers a final answer. This is why frustration becomes so dangerous when attached to identity. Once people interpret rejection as proof of personal inadequacy, persistence begins feeling emotionally irrational. The nervous system stops protecting the dream and starts protecting the ego from further damage. And the tragedy is that many potential futures die in complete silence long before the world ever has the chance to reject them fully. But beneath rejection itself lies something even more destructive than humiliation. Because eventually, some human beings stop trying not because they are rejected, but because they become convinced nothing they do can change the outcome anymore. By the late 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman and his colleagues began conducting a series of experiments that would uncover one of the darkest psychological mechanisms ever documented. The subjects were dogs. In one phase of the experiment, some dogs were placed inside harnesses and exposed to mild electric shocks. Certain dogs could stop the shocks by pressing a panel with their noses. Others had no control at all. No matter what they did, the discomfort continued until the researchers ended it themselves. At first, the dogs reacted intensely. They barked, pulled against the restraints, twisted their bodies desperately trying to escape. But eventually, something changed. The dogs exposed to unavoidable shocks began slowing down psychologically. Their attempts weakened. Their movements became smaller. Over time, many stopped resisting entirely. They remained passive even while discomfort continued. What disturbed researchers was not simply the physical reaction. It was the collapse of expectation. The animals appeared to learn that their behavior no longer mattered. Effort lost meaning. Action detached from outcome. And once that belief settled into the nervous system, motivation itself began shutting down. Later, researchers moved the dogs into a different environment called a shuttle box, where escape was easy. The dogs only needed to jump over a low barrier to avoid the shocks completely. Many never tried. Even when freedom was physically available, they stayed still and endured the pain. The body was capable of escaping, but the mind had already surrendered. The implications of the experiment reached far beyond animal behavior. Seligman called the phenomenon learned helplessness. The phrase described a terrifying psychological process. When repeated exposure to uncontrollable failure trains a living being to stop attempting escape even after circumstances change. This was not laziness, not weakness, not lack of intelligence. It was adaptation. The nervous system had concluded that effort was useless. And once that conclusion forms deeply enough, passivity starts feeling rational. Human beings experience this process constantly. A person applies for jobs repeatedly and hears nothing back. A relationship fails after years of effort. A student studies intensely yet continues struggling. Someone attempts to change their life over and over but sees no visible progress. At first, they fight. Then frustration accumulates. Then exhaustion appears. Then expectation collapses. Eventually, many people stop taking action not because opportunities disappeared, but because the brain no longer believes action can influence reality meaningfully. This is the hidden danger of repeated failure. Failure itself is rarely the final destroyer. The real damage occurs when the nervous system begins predicting future defeat automatically. The person starts approaching life already emotionally defeated before events even unfold. Hope feels naive.
Initiative feels pointless.
Possibility itself begins shrinking psychologically. And the most dangerous part is that helplessness often becomes invisible from the outside. The person may still appear functional, but internally, they have stopped believing their choices matter. What makes learned helplessness so psychologically devastating is that it changes perception itself. The helpless individual no longer evaluates situations objectively. The brain begins filtering reality through prior defeat. Neutral events feel threatening.
Délai feel permanent.
Obstacles appear larger than they are. Even possible solutions become difficult to recognize because the nervous system expects failure before effort begins. Researchers later discovered similar patterns in human depression and chronic hopelessness. People exposed to repeated, uncontrollable stress often developed emotional paralysis. Some stopped pursuing opportunities. Some isolated themselves socially. Others lost the ability to imagine positive future outcomes entirely. The mind adapted to disappointment by reducing expectation. And in many cases, this adaptation temporarily reduced emotional pain. That is what makes helplessness seductive. Giving up can feel safer than hoping again. Because hope creates vulnerability. Effort creates uncertainty. Persistence creates exposure to further disappointment. So the nervous system attempts to solve the problem by shutting ambition down completely. The tragedy is that this psychological defense often continues long after the original conditions disappear. The external prison opens, but the internal one remains active. The individual continues living as though escape is impossible because the brain already memorized surrender as survival. This is why some people remain trapped inside lives they technically possess the power to change. Not because change is unavailable, but because repeated frustration trained the nervous system to stop recognizing freedom when it appears. The experiments revealed something deeply disturbing about the relationship between frustration and identity. Human beings do not merely react to pain. They construct beliefs from repeated emotional experiences. And those beliefs eventually determine whether action feels possible or pointless. This means that one of the greatest dangers in life is not immediate failure. It is prolonged exposure to situations where effort appears disconnected from outcome. Because once the nervous system internalizes helplessness, people stop testing reality. They stop exploring alternatives. They stop discovering whether conditions have changed. The mind freezes itself in outdated conclusions. Someone rejected repeatedly may stop pursuing connection entirely. Someone who struggled financially for years may stop believing opportunity exists. Someone who failed publicly may stop risking visibility forever. Not because future success became impossible, because the emotional memory of failure became stronger than present reality. This is how frustration evolves into surrender. Quietly, gradually, without dramatic collapse. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that many individuals living in psychological helplessness still appear normal from the outside. They wake up, work, speak, smile, survive. Yet internally, their relationship with possibility has already died. But what researchers eventually uncovered after this was even more uncomfortable. Because there are environments capable of reversing helplessness completely, and others capable of manufacturing extreme psychological endurance in ways most people would never voluntarily choose to experience. On the beaches of Coronado, California, candidates entering Navy SEAL training encounter a ritual designed to break the body until the mind reveals its true structure. It is called Hell Week. For more than 5 days, trainees endure continuous physical stress with almost no sleep. They run through freezing surf before sunrise, carry heavy boats over their heads until their necks burn with pressure, crawl through wet sand while instructors scream inches from their faces. Muscles tear, skin blisters, saltwater enters wounds repeatedly. Hallucinations begin appearing from exhaustion. Many candidates arrive in extraordinary physical condition. Many still quit. The training exposes a brutal reality that military psychologists and instructors have observed for decades. Human collapse rarely begins in the muscles first. It begins in interpretation. The cold itself is not always what destroys endurance. The exhaustion itself is not always what causes surrender. It is the meaning attached to the suffering. Some trainees begin mentally projecting pain into the future. They imagine how many hours remain, how much worse conditions might become. Their attention locks onto discomfort continuously until the nervous system magnifies every sensation into psychological overload. Others reduce reality into smaller units. One breath, one wave, one command at a time. This difference changes survival, because the brain struggles to endure abstract, endless suffering. But it can often survive immediate, manageable discomfort repeated moment by moment. Hell Week was never merely testing strength. It was exposing the fragile psychological relationship between pain, time, and meaning. One object sits at the center of Hell Week like a permanent psychological temptation. A brass bell. Any trainee who decides to quit only needs to ring it 3 times. No negotiation. No argument. The suffering ends immediately. That bell transforms the entire environment. Because once escape becomes visible, endurance becomes psychological warfare against the self. The exhausted mind begins bargaining constantly. You have already proven enough. This pain is unnecessary. You can always come back later. Under extreme fatigue, the brain stops prioritizing long-term identity and begins prioritizing immediate relief. Survival instincts narrow attention toward ending discomfort as fast as possible. Every freezing wave feels personal. Every command feels unbearable. Small frustrations become emotionally gigantic because exhaustion weakens cognitive resistance. Former SEAL instructors have repeatedly observed that many physically capable candidates collapse mentally long before their bodies truly fail. Some quit while still medically capable of continuing. Some surrender minutes before scheduled rest periods. Some break emotionally after watching others quit around them. The environment spreads psychological contagion. One person's surrender changes what the group believes is possible. This reveals something disturbing about frustration and human endurance. People do not evaluate suffering objectively. They evaluate whether the suffering still feels meaningful. The moment pain appears disconnected from purpose, motivation begins collapsing rapidly. And that same process happens far beyond military training grounds. Human beings everywhere abandon goals not always because conditions become impossible, but because emotional exhaustion convinces them the struggle no longer means anything. Researchers studying elite military performance later discovered something counterintuitive about endurance. The strongest individuals were often not the people who felt less pain. They were the people who recovered psychologically faster from moments of pain, doubt, and emotional instability. This distinction matters enormously. Many candidates during Hell Week experience mental collapse temporarily. Panic appears. Fear appears. Self-doubt becomes overwhelming. But certain individuals regain functional focus more rapidly instead of remaining trapped inside the emotional spiral. That ability changes everything under prolonged stress. Because resilience is not permanent confidence. It is repeated recovery. The nervous system learns that discomfort does not automatically require retreat. Cold can be survived. Exhaustion can be survived. Fear can be survived. Even humiliation can be survived. Over time, The brain stops interpreting every painful state as emergency. This adaptation creates a profound psychological shift. Suffering remains real, but it loses some of its authority. The person discovers they are capable of functioning while uncomfortable instead of waiting to feel comfortable before functioning. That realization is transformative. Most human beings unknowingly organize their lives in reverse. They wait for certainty before action, motivation before discipline, confidence before exposure, emotional readiness before commitment. Hell Week destroys that illusion brutally. Action comes first. Comfort comes later, sometimes much later. And once someone experiences that directly, they begin understanding that the limits governing human endurance are often psychological negotiations disguised as physical boundaries. What Hell Week ultimately exposes is not simply human toughness. It exposes the hidden relationship between identity and suffering. Candidates who survive the training often describe a psychological transition where pain stops feeling like evidence of weakness. Instead, it becomes confirmation that they are still engaged in the process itself. The meaning changes, and once meaning changes, endurance expands dramatically. This is why controlled exposure to hardship can permanently alter the nervous system. The brain learns through experience that discomfort is survivable, that exhaustion is temporary, that panic does not always predict danger accurately. The individual stops fearing internal sensations with the same intensity because they have already functioned inside them repeatedly. Most people never train this capacity intentionally. Instead, modern life conditions avoidance. Avoid boredom. Avoid uncertainty. Avoid emotional exposure. Avoid failure. Avoid rejection. The nervous system becomes increasingly fragile because it rarely practices remaining functional under discomfort. Then reality arrives without permission. Loss, pressure, isolation, fatigue, uncertainty stretching across months or years. And suddenly the person discovers they built a life optimized for comfort rather than resilience. That realization can become psychologically catastrophic. Because eventually every human being encounters conditions where motivation disappears completely. No applause remains.
No emotion el rigor de raíz.
No certainty exists that the struggle will produce anything meaningful at all. And what happens to the mind in those moments, when effort continues without visible hope, reveals something far more dangerous than physical exhaustion. For years, many psychologists and business leaders assumed motivation came primarily from large rewards. Money, recognition, promotions, public achievement. But researcher Teresa Amabile at Harvard Business School began uncovering evidence pointing toward something far quieter and far more psychologically powerful. Together with researcher Stephen Kramer, Amabile studied hundreds of employees working inside real companies across different industries. Participants recorded daily experiences, emotions, motivation levels, setbacks, and successes in detailed work diaries. Over time, thousands of entries accumulated, revealing patterns most organizations completely overlooked. The strongest emotional driver was not praise. It was progress. Even small visible movement in meaningful work dramatically improved emotional resilience, engagement, creativity, and persistence. Tiny wins mattered disproportionately. Solving a minor technical problem, finishing one difficult section of a project, clarifying confusion, moving one step closer toward completion. The nervous system responded intensely to these moments, because progress changes psychological perception of effort. Without progress, work begins feeling like energy disappearing into emptiness. Human beings can tolerate exhaustion surprisingly well when movement feels real. But when effort produces no visible effect, frustration accumulates rapidly. Motivation starts collapsing not necessarily from difficulty itself, but from the emotional experience of stagnation. This explains why so many people psychologically break during long-term goals. The problem is often not suffering alone. It is invisible suffering, effort without evidence, discipline without visible movement, persistence without emotional confirmation that anything is changing. That condition slowly poisons the relationship between action and hope. One of the most important discoveries in Amabel's research was how disproportionately the human mind reacts to setbacks compared to progress. Small progress elevated motivation sharply. Small setbacks damaged it immediately. The nervous system constantly monitors whether effort appears productive or futile. This monitoring happens beneath conscious awareness much of the time. A delayed response, an unresolved obstacle, a task repeatedly interrupted. Tiny frustrations accumulate emotionally until the brain begins interpreting the entire process as resistance. And once that interpretation forms, behavior changes quickly. People procrastinate more. Attention weakens. Creativity narrows. Emotional fatigue increases. Not necessarily because the individual lacks discipline, but because the mind starts conserving energy against what feels like pointless expenditure. This creates a dangerous cycle. When progress becomes invisible, motivation drops. When motivation drops, output decreases. When output decreases, progress slows even further. Eventually, the person begins emotionally associating the work itself with helplessness and frustration. But the reverse also proved true. Even modest signs of advancement could interrupt that downward spiral powerfully. A solved problem, a completed paragraph, a measurable improvement. These moments restored psychological momentum because they reconnected effort with outcome. That connection matters more than most people realize. Human beings are not fueled only by reward. They are fueled by evidence that movement is occurring. Without that evidence, time itself starts feeling psychologically heavy. Days blur together. Effort becomes harder to sustain. The future begins feeling unreachable not because it actually is, but because the nervous system can no longer detect movement toward it clearly enough. This research exposed a hidden truth about frustration that modern culture often misunderstands completely. Human beings do not necessarily need constant happiness to continue. They need signs that their suffering is producing movement. That distinction changes everything. A person can endure exhausting training, difficult work, repeated practice, or emotional sacrifice far longer than expected if the brain detects meaningful progress. But when movement disappears psychologically, even manageable effort begins feeling unbearable. This is why stagnation damages motivation so aggressively. The nervous system starts interpreting the absence of progress as wasted life energy. And the modern world intensifies this problem constantly. People compare their invisible gradual process against other people's visible outcomes. They expect transformation to feel dramatic, fast, cinematic. So when real progress arrives slowly, almost invisibly, the brain dismisses it as insufficient. Many individuals abandon meaningful goals while improvement is already happening beneath the surface. The adaptation is simply too gradual for the nervous system to emotionally register in real time. Amabel's findings suggested something profoundly important. Tiny wins are not psychologically small. They function as survival signals. They tell the brain, continue, your effort is affecting reality. Without those signals, frustration expands uncontrollably. The mind starts magnifying obstacles while minimizing advancement. And eventually the person begins believing they are trapped, when in reality they may still be moving forward incrementally every single day. The tragedy is that slow progress often feels emotionally identical to failure while it is happening. The progress principle revealed something deeply unsettling about how human beings evaluate their lives. Most people are terrible at perceiving gradual transformation while it is occurring. The nervous system craves dramatic evidence, sudden breakthroughs, immediate validation, obvious rewards. But meaningful adaptation often happens below emotional detection thresholds. Skills improve quietly. Emotional resilience strengthens invisibly. Discipline accumulates without spectacle. And because the brain struggles to feel this incremental change directly, many individuals assume nothing is happening at all. That illusion becomes psychologically dangerous. A person may already be evolving while emotionally feeling stuck. A relationship may already be healing while still feeling fragile. A skill may already be strengthening while performance still feels imperfect. The mind interprets the absence of dramatic evidence as absence of progress itself. This is why frustration becomes so deceptive during long-term growth. Reality may be shifting slowly beneath the surface while the emotional system continues screaming that effort is useless. Amabel's work suggested that protecting motivation is not only about reducing difficulty. It is about maintaining visible connection between effort and movement. Without that connection, the nervous system begins collapsing into discouragement even during meaningful progress. But there is another side to persistence that becomes far darker than slow advancement. Because some individuals eventually confront the opposite experience entirely. Years of visible effort, thousands of attempts, relentless experimentation, and still failure continues repeating over and over again. Inside Thomas Edison's laboratory in Menlo Park during the late 19th century, failure became routine. Filaments burned too quickly, glass shattered, materials overheated, experiments collapsed after hours of work. Again and again, prototypes failed. Edison and his team tested thousands of materials while attempting to create a commercially viable incandescent light bulb. Carbonized bamboo, cotton thread, linen, wood fibers. Countless combinations were examined, discarded, modified, and tested again. Days blurred into nights inside workshops filled with soot, heat, exhaustion, and relentless repetition. To outsiders, the process looked irrational. How could someone continue after so many failed attempts? The question itself revealed something important about human psychology. Most people interpret repeated failure emotionally. Edison increasingly interpreted it mechanically. One widely repeated statement attributed to him captured this mindset. "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Whether quoted perfectly or paraphrased through history, the principle behind it reflected a documented pattern in Edison's approach. Failed experiments were not treated primarily as personal humiliation. They were treated as information. That distinction changes the emotional structure of persistence completely. Because once failure becomes data instead of identity, repetition becomes psychologically survivable. The average person experiences repeated setbacks as accumulating evidence against themselves. Edison attempted to remove himself emotionally from the equation. The experiment failed, not the human being conducting it. This sounds simple. In reality, it may be one of the most psychologically difficult transformations a person can make. What made Edison's process emotionally extraordinary was not optimism. It was detachment from immediate emotional interpretation. Most human beings unconsciously personalize outcomes. A failed attempt becomes, "I am failing." A rejection becomes, "I am not enough." A delay becomes, "I am falling behind." The nervous system fuses identity with results automatically. Edison approached experimentation differently. Each unsuccessful prototype narrowed possibilities. Every malfunction eliminated another incorrect path. The emotional meaning of failure changed because the function of failure changed. This reframing protected persistence. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but enough to continue. The laboratory itself became a physical representation of accumulated frustration transformed into process. Thousands of imperfect attempts surrounded the work daily. Burned materials, failed tests, collapsed designs. Yet instead of serving as emotional evidence to stop, they became directional markers guiding the next experiment. That mindset contradicts normal human instinct. The brain naturally seeks emotional closure. It wants successful outcomes quickly because uncertainty consumes energy. Repeated failure creates cognitive and emotional fatigue. Eventually, most people stop experimenting not because they exhausted possibility, but because they exhausted emotional tolerance. This is why mastery carries such a hidden psychological cost. To persist long enough for meaningful innovation, a person must repeatedly encounter evidence of imperfection without emotionally collapsing under it. Most individuals cannot separate outcome from self-worth consistently enough to survive that process. And when frustration becomes personal, every failed attempt starts feeling heavier than the last. Until eventually the mind stops seeing experimentation. It only sees humiliation repeated endlessly. There is another psychological layer hidden inside Edison's persistence that modern culture rarely discusses honestly. Repetition changes perception. When people first encounter failure, the emotional reaction is often intense. Embarrassment, anger, doubt. But repeated exposure to controlled failure can gradually alter the nervous system's sensitivity. The event remains unpleasant, yet it loses some of its catastrophic emotional meaning through familiarity. This adaptation matters enormously, because fear depends heavily on emotional novelty. The unknown feels overwhelming partly because the nervous system has not yet learned how to metabolize it. But once someone experiences repeated setbacks without complete psychological destruction, the brain begins recalibrating what constitutes danger. Failure becomes survivable. Imperfection becomes expected. Temporary frustration stops feeling like existential collapse. Edison's environment accelerated this adaptation continuously. Experimentation normalized error. Mistakes became structural components of progress rather than interruptions to it. The laboratory functioned almost like a machine designed to absorb disappointment systematically. That idea clashes violently with how many people approach achievement today. Modern culture encourages performance identity. Individuals feel pressure to appear competent constantly. Mistakes become public evidence. Failure threatens social image. So instead of experimenting openly, many people avoid uncertainty entirely to protect self-worth. But avoidance creates fragility. A person who cannot emotionally tolerate imperfection eventually stops attempting anything difficult enough to require growth. And over time, the fear of failing publicly becomes stronger than the desire to succeed privately. The story of Edison's light bulb experiments reveals a disturbing truth about mastery itself. Persistence is not merely endurance. It is emotional restructuring. The individual must gradually stop interpreting frustration as a verdict on identity and begin interpreting it as operational feedback. Otherwise, the psychological cost becomes unbearable. Every obstacle drains meaning. Every failed attempt attacks self-worth. Eventually, the person no longer evaluates the process rationally because the emotional system is overloaded. This is why so many people abandon meaningful pursuits long before reaching competence. The early stages of mastery are saturated with visible inadequacy. Repetition exposes flaws constantly. Progress arrives unevenly. Results appear slowly. The nervous system receives continuous evidence of imperfection without immediate reward. For most human beings, that emotional environment feels intolerable. But Edison's process demonstrated something radically different. Repeated failure can become psychologically neutralized through interpretation. The event remains the same. The meaning changes. And once meaning changes, persistence becomes dramatically more sustainable. Yet there is a dangerous limit hidden inside this idea. Because not all frustration leads toward mastery. Sometimes effort continues for years without visible success. Sometimes exhaustion accumulates faster than reward. Sometimes human beings continue enduring long after motivation disappears entirely. And what happens when persistence survives even after hope itself begins collapsing reveals something far more complicated than discipline alone. In 1978, a teenager named Michael Jordan walked into Emsley A. Laney High School in Wilmington, North Carolina, carrying expectations larger than his body. He wanted a place on the varsity basketball team. He did not get it. Jordan was cut during tryouts while another student, Leroy Smith, earned one of the available spots. The decision became one of the most repeated stories in sports history, not because rejection itself was unusual, but because of what happened psychologically afterward. Jordan later described going home devastated. He cried, "The humiliation was not private." Team selections inside schools become social events instantly. Other students know who made the roster. Friends know. Teachers know. The body experiences rejection publicly, under observation. That changes the emotional intensity dramatically. Human beings are deeply sensitive to social exclusion because the nervous system interprets status loss almost like physical danger. Embarrassment activates stress responses powerfully. Shame narrows thinking. Identity becomes unstable. The mind begins asking dangerous questions. Maybe they were right about me. Maybe I am not exceptional. Maybe I wanted something I was never capable of becoming. Most people experience rejection as a final answer. Jordan transformed it into fuel. Not immediately, not romantically. The emotional pain was real. But instead of allowing humiliation to become permanent identity, he converted it into behavioral intensity. He practiced obsessively, returned to the gym repeatedly, focused on skill development with increasing seriousness. This is the hidden psychological fork inside every humiliation. Some people internalize rejection as proof of limitation. Others metabolize it as pressure that reorganizes behavior. What makes public humiliation psychologically dangerous is that it attacks more than confidence. It attacks belonging. The human nervous system evolved inside social groups where exclusion once carried survival consequences. Being rejected publicly creates a powerful emotional imprint because the brain interprets social failure as a threat to identity and security simultaneously. This is why embarrassment lingers so long in memory. Years later, people still replay moments where they were ignored, laughed at, overlooked, or exposed as inadequate. The emotional brain stores humiliation with extraordinary intensity because it wants to prevent similar pain from happening again. Avoidance becomes the natural response. After rejection, many individuals lower ambition automatically. They stop exposing themselves to evaluation. They become quieter, safer, more psychologically hidden. The goal is no longer growth. The goal becomes protection. Jordan's response moved in the opposite direction. Instead of retreating from the environment that humiliated him, he increased engagement with it. He practiced before school, after school, constant repetition, constant exposure to inadequacy. The rejection did not disappear emotionally, but it became integrated into a larger internal narrative. I will outwork this limitation. That shift matters profoundly, because resilient individuals are not necessarily less emotionally wounded by rejection. Often they feel rejection intensely. The difference is that they channel emotional pain into sustained adaptive behavior instead of emotional paralysis. Humiliation becomes energy, not healthy energy, not peaceful energy, but directed energy. And sometimes that distinction determines whether rejection becomes permanent collapse or psychological transformation. As Jordan's career evolved, the mythology surrounding his success often erased the psychological importance of that early rejection. People tend to romanticize outcomes. They see championships, fame, dominance, global recognition, but they overlook the emotional architecture built underneath those achievements. Jordan repeatedly spoke throughout his career about failure, missing shots, losing games, being trusted in critical moments, and failing publicly. One of his most famous statements captured this relationship directly. "I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." The statement matters because it contradicts how most people interpret high performance. Elite achievement does not eliminate failure. It increases exposure to it. The higher someone aims, the more visible mistakes become. More pressure, more scrutiny, more opportunities to disappoint others publicly. Resilient individuals do not reach greatness because humiliation disappears from their lives. They reach it because humiliation stops controlling their behavior. Jordan's early rejection created an emotional memory powerful enough to reorganize his standards permanently. Coaches, teammates, and competitors later described obsessive competitiveness that bordered on pathological. The original wound never fully vanished. It evolved into relentless internal pressure. This reveals something uncomfortable about resilience. Sometimes the same emotional injury that could have destroyed someone becomes the force driving extraordinary performance. Pain does not automatically weaken human beings. Under certain conditions, it sharpens them. The deeper lesson inside Jordan's rejection is not simply about motivation. It is about interpretation. Two people can experience the same humiliation and emerge psychologically transformed in opposite directions. One becomes smaller afterward, more cautious, more afraid of exposure. The other develops greater tolerance for discomfort, criticism, and imperfection because survival through humiliation changes the nervous system's relationship to fear. This adaptation is rarely clean or peaceful. Public rejection leaves scars. The memory remains vivid because identity itself was threatened. But once someone survives that experience repeatedly, something important begins changing internally. External judgment loses part of its absolute authority. Embarrassment still hurts, but it no longer completely controls action. That is one of the hidden foundations of resilience. The person stops organizing life entirely around avoiding emotional pain. Jordan's story became globally famous because the outcome was extraordinary. But millions of quieter versions of this process happen constantly. Human beings are rejected from teams, careers, relationships, opportunities, communities. Some psychologically disappear afterward. Others continue exposing themselves to uncertainty despite the emotional cost. And that difference compounds across entire lifetimes. Because eventually every ambitious person reaches a brutal threshold where effort alone no longer protects self-belief. The applause disappears. Validation becomes inconsistent. Fatigue accumulates. Doubt grows louder than external encouragement. And what separates those who continue from those who surrender at that point may have almost nothing to do with talent at all. After decades of underperformance, the British cycling team stood at a point most organizations quietly accept as their limit. They were not terrible, but they were not dominant either. In professional cycling, that middle state is often more psychologically dangerous than outright failure, because it allows the illusion that effort is present while results remain stagnant. Then Dave Brailsford arrived as performance director and introduced a philosophy that would later become known as the aggregation of marginal gains. The idea was simple in language, but radical in execution. Instead of searching for one transformative breakthrough, the team began searching for tiny improvements in every possible variable affecting performance. Not just training intensity, not just strategy, but everything. Saddle comfort, tire pressure, sleep environment, hand hygiene to reduce illness risk, pillow selection for recovery, nutrition timing, bike weight optimization in grams, aerodynamic positioning measured in microscopic adjustments. Individually, none of these changes looked meaningful. Emotionally, they were almost frustrating, because human psychology craves visible breakthroughs. It wants dramatic transformation it can feel immediately. The British cycling approach demanded tolerance for invisible progress, where effort produced results too small to emotionally register in isolation. But over time, something unusual happened. Those marginal gains accumulated, and the accumulation began reshaping performance in ways that eventually became impossible to ignore. What made the British cycling transformation psychologically difficult was not the complexity of the method. It was the absence of emotional reward. Athletes and staff were constantly making adjustments that did not feel meaningful in the moment. There were no dramatic training breakthroughs, no instant performance leaps, only continuous refinement of small variables that seemed insignificant individually. This created a unique psychological challenge. The brain struggled to justify effort without immediate visible payoff. Most human systems are wired for feedback loops that are fast and obvious. You act, you see result, you adjust. But marginal gains operate on a delayed aggregation model. The feedback is real, but distributed across time and layers of change. That makes patience structurally necessary. Over time, however, the accumulation began producing measurable differences in performance outcomes. Small improvements in recovery reduced fatigue accumulation. Small improvements in equipment reduced wasted energy. Small improvements in routines reduced avoidable errors. None of these changes felt revolutionary, but together they reshaped competitive output at elite level. This is where the psychological lesson becomes uncomfortable. Extraordinary performance often does not feel extraordinary while it is being built. It feels repetitive, feels slow, it feels insufficient. And most people misinterpret that emotional experience as evidence that nothing significant is happening. As years passed, the results of the British cycling strategy began to surface in competitions. But the most important shift was not just in medals. It was in organizational psychology. The team developed a tolerance for frustration that most competitive environments cannot sustain. Athletes and staff learned to trust processes that did not produce immediate emotional validation. They continued refining details even when progress felt invisible. This is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of high performance. Consistency under low emotional reward is often more decisive than bursts of motivation. Motivation fluctuates. Frustration remains constant. So systems that depend on feeling inspired collapse under pressure. Systems that function without emotional reinforcement survive long enough for compounding effects to appear. The British cycling model proved that excellence can emerge from environments where progress feels almost imperceptible day by day. But only if people are willing to continue functioning inside that emotional ambiguity. Most individuals cannot sustain that condition. They mistake lack of emotional feedback for lack of progress. And they quit long before accumulation becomes visible. The deeper implication of marginal gains extends far beyond sports. It describes a fundamental mismatch between human emotional perception and how reality actually compounds. Human beings are not naturally calibrated to recognize slow accumulation. The nervous system is designed to detect immediate threats and immediate rewards. That evolutionary wiring creates a bias. We overvalue sudden change and undervalue gradual transformation, which means most meaningful improvement feels emotionally wrong while it is happening. The British cycling success was not just about better bikes or better training. It was about enduring the psychological discomfort of slow progress long enough for compounding effects to reveal themselves. This is where the core tension becomes unavoidable. Frustration is not always a signal of failure. Sometimes it is simply the emotional cost of processes that work too slowly for the brain to appreciate in real time. But that cost is not evenly distributed across people. Some abandon the process early. Others continue despite emotional ambiguity. And a small number persist long enough for invisible improvements to accumulate into outcomes that appear sudden from the outside. The illusion of sudden success hides years of imperceptible resistance. And that raises a final, unsettling question. If progress only becomes visible after long periods of emotional discomfort, how many lives stop just before the system they were building finally begins to work? There is a moment in every human attempt at growth where the original motivation stops working. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes irrelevant. Early effort is fueled by clarity. People begin with a story in their mind. Who they want to become, what they want to achieve, how different life will feel once they succeed. That story is powerful enough to start movement. It is not powerful enough to sustain it, because reality introduces something that imagination does not prepare for: repetition without emotional reward. At that stage, the mind starts negotiating. It asks for proof. It demands acceleration. It searches for signs that effort is being worth it. And when those signs are not immediate, doubt begins to replace structure. What is rarely understood is that doubt is not the enemy of progress. It is the environment where progress either stabilizes or collapses. Some minds interpret doubt as information and continue operating anyway. Others interpret it as a verdict and begin withdrawing energy quietly, long before they consciously decide to quit. The difference is not intelligence. It is tolerance for unresolved outcomes. Most people assume certainty is required for action. But every meaningful path forward is built inside uncertainty that never fully resolves while you are inside it. There is no emotional permission granted in advance. Only continuation without reassurance. There is another layer most people never confront directly. Frustration does not arrive evenly. It compounds. Not just in external circumstances, but internally through memory. Every previous attempt that did not succeed becomes part of the emotional weight carried into the next attempt. This is why sustained effort often feels heavier over time, even when external conditions have not changed. The nervous system remembers accumulation more than logic does. So even when a new attempt is objectively fresh, it is emotionally contaminated by everything that came before it. This is where many collapse without understanding why. They think they are reacting to the present moment, but they are actually reacting to a history of invisible attempts stored as emotional residue. And unless that residue is reinterpreted, it turns every new effort into an extension of past disappointment. What makes continued action possible is not the removal of that weight. It is the ability to stop treating that weight as a stopping signal. At a certain point, progress stops being about feeling ready. It becomes about refusing to let accumulated discomfort decide what is possible. That is a fundamentally different internal structure. One is driven by emotional alignment. The other is driven by behavioral continuity under misalignment. At some point, the mind begins to realize something uncomfortable about itself. It is not designed for truth. It is designed for survival. And survival systems prioritize immediate emotional interpretation over long-term structural understanding. That means the brain constantly tries to convert uncertainty into meaning, even when meaning is premature or incorrect. This is where most internal collapse originates, not from lack of ability, but from premature interpretation of incomplete processes. A difficult phase is labeled as failure. A slow phase is labeled as incompetence. Painful phase is labeled as wrong direction. And once those labels are applied, behavior adjusts accordingly long before reality has had time to complete its trajectory. The most dangerous moment is not when things are failing. It is when interpretation closes the possibility of continuation. Because once a process is emotionally defined too early, it stops being allowed to evolve. What looks like quitting is often just meaning locking in too soon. There is a final point where everything converges. Frustration, rejection, repetition, delay, humiliation, invisibility, all of it, not as separate experiences, but as one continuous condition of sustained effort. Most people try to resolve that condition by eliminating discomfort. They search for a version of progress that feels smoother, faster, more emotionally rewarding. But that version does not exist at scale. Every meaningful transformation in human capability requires a phase where emotional feedback becomes unreliable. During that phase, one truth becomes unavoidable. Feeling aligned is not a requirement for continuing. It is often absent precisely when continuation matters most. And the mind will constantly try to convince you that absence of relief means absence of progress. That interpretation is persuasive, but it is not structurally accurate, because progress does not announce itself while it is forming. It only becomes visible after it has already survived the conditions that would normally stop it. And by the time it is visible, the internal experience that created it is already gone. There is a simple, final truth underneath all of this. Most people do not fail because they cannot endure difficulty. They fail because they require difficulty to feel justified before they continue through it. But difficulty does not negotiate. It only reveals what continues anyway.